I'm Jim Whitcomb, and I'm going to share a few observations from my experience at JFK International Airport in New York on August 14th, where my son Ashton and I were getting ready to embark on a Lufthansa flight from Terminal 1 to Berlin. That was an episode of a suspected shooting event or terrorist attack on the terminal. At the time we were there, we were both at the gate for our flight to depart from Berlin, and Ashton had wandered off to a bookstore to pick up something before we got on the flight. I was sitting there looking around idly, and all of a sudden noticed or watched with real surprise a flood of people stampeding towards me, jumping over luggage and obstacle, climbing over security barriers, security personnel running an equal terror, some shouting active shooter, and people looking over their shoulders saying that there were gunmen behind them. And what was clear to me sitting there was that we were being enveloped in some kind of terrorist or mass shooting event. People were streaming by me, shouting, crying, getting separated from children, dropping their baggage wherever they were, and running off down stairwells, actually down to the ground, out onto the tarmac around some jet aircraft. I moved to cover right near where I was and was thinking about my son, who was further up in the terminal where people appeared to be running from. I dashed across to a column and huddled behind the column in case there were gunmen following the crowd who seemed to think that there were gunmen behind them. And eventually those people were followed by police and SWAT team personnel who were brandishing heavy weapons, ordering people to get down, talking about active shooters, telling us also to keep our hands up in the air as they pointed guns at us and all around. They were heavily armored and were dispersing through the terminal looking for the terrorists. About 20 to 30 minutes passed by, and eventually people began to get up, pick themselves up and out of cover, and begin to walk back towards they had abandoned their baggage. I walked towards where our baggage was. In the meantime, by the way, my son and I had been texting each other. He had assured me that he was okay. He was in the news kiosk taking cover, and they had pulled down the metal shades or blinds to protect them, everyone within that kiosk, from what they thought was a terrorist or a gunman of some kind. At any rate, Ashton and I reunited where our luggage was. Word came down from other civilians that the police wanted us to evacuate the terminal, and we began walking out. And we're reaching the outer perimeter of the terminal building when another stampede developed. People began yelling and streaming out again, and Ashton and I took cover again just outside the building, which had big glass panels. We were behind another big concrete column trying to figure out what to do, and we, after a few seconds there, decided the best thing to do was to get away from the terminal building, because the second stampede clearly believed that there were active shooters or terrorists still within the building. We were outside the terminal building. There were large crowds of people first flattening out on the ground or getting behind cover of roadway barriers, because they thought that either gunmen were coming out or there was a possibility of an explosion. But gradually the crowd deconcentrated, though remained in a fairly close area just outside the terminal building in 90-degree heat for 2 or 3 hours with no information, The police, the few police that we saw refused even to answer questions. In the meantime, car after car and armored truck after armored truck of more police arrived in the building as they went through to look for the gunmen or terrorists. What became clear was that the policemen outside the building were not communicating with each other, because after a while, and this might have been a couple of hours, airport employees began to file in, and they said they had received instructions to re-enter the building, to which the police in the perimeter of the building said, and we heard them say this, that they had received no word that anyone was supposed to go back in the building. And eventually the crowd, because it was so hot outside, the crowd began to filter back into the building to get into the cooler air of the air-conditioned terminal. And the police stepped aside to let them in, and Asha and I walked back into the terminal building, went a certain way, almost to the security barriers. Then the police began to say, "No, you have to get out again," and began pushing everybody back to the perimeter of the building. So very little coordination between police units, and they didn't seem to know what was going on. I was standing next to an English couple who said that they hid themselves into a utility closet while this stampede of people rushed by, basically because they had learned that that's what they ought to get out of sight completely in the event of a terrorist attack. At any rate, it was complete chaos, and the subsequent claims of the police that they had effected an evacuation of the building was laughable, because the police imposed no control. The word to evacuate the building was carried hand to mouth. There were no announcements. For a couple of hours, when announcements were made, they were by voice and no one could hear them, notwithstanding the loudspeakers available throughout the terminal. It was a complete fiasco by the various police units in charge there at JFK.